You know, after more than 40 years sitting on this bench, I truly believed I had seen every kind of fear a courtroom could hold. I thought I understood silence, anxiety, and uncertainty. But the morning this woman walked into my courtroom, shaking, clutching papers, and holding on to a translator like a lifeline, I felt something different settle in my chest. What happened that day reminded me why I still put on these robes every morning, and why kindness matters just as much as the law. Let me tell you exactly what happened, because this story is about dignity, understanding, and the quiet strength of someone who came here with nothing but hope. But before I tell you this whole story, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because what I'm about to share with you is something that needs to be heard. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single word of this. I've been a judge in Providence for over 40 years, and every single morning starts the same way for me. I wake up early, usually before the sun is fully up, and I sit quietly at my kitchen table with a cup of strong black coffee. I don't add sugar, I never have. My wife laughs about it, says it matches my personality. But for me, that coffee is more than a habit. It's a moment to think, to prepare myself for whatever stories are about to walk into my courtroom that day. My father used to tell me something every morning before he went to work. He came to this country from Italy with almost nothing, and he worked harder than anyone I knew. He'd look at me and say, "Frank, remember this. Treat people with respect before you ever judge them." Those words stayed with me my entire life, and they guide me every time I sit behind that bench. By 8:15 every morning, I'm walking into the courthouse. I've been doing that since the 1980s, and I still feel a sense of responsibility the moment I step inside. My clerk, Christina, is usually already there. She knows exactly how I like my coffee, and most mornings I can smell it before I even reach my chambers. That smell, mixed with the sound of papers shuffling and footsteps in the hallway, tells me another day of justice is about to begin. That particular morning felt different, though. I remember noticing it before court even started. The air felt heavier, like something important was waiting. I sat at my desk reviewing the day's docket, flipping through files, making notes in the margins like I always do. But one case made me pause longer than usual. I don't know why. My gut was telling me to pay attention. When court began, I took my seat and looked out over my courtroom. I've learned over the years that you can learn a lot just by watching how people enter. Some walk in confidently. Some avoid eye contact. Some are angry before they even speak. That morning, as the first few cases were called, everything seemed routine. Traffic violations, missed court dates, small fines, nothing unusual. Then I noticed her. I saw her standing near the back of my courtroom, holding on to a woman who I assumed was a translator. Her hands were trembling, not slightly, noticeably. I watched her shift her weight from one foot to the other, clutching a folder so tightly her knuckles were white. I remember thinking to myself, this woman is terrified, and she hasn't even said a word yet. When her case was called, I watched her walk forward slowly. Every step looked like it took effort. I could see her eyes darting around the room, trying to understand where she was supposed to stand, what she was supposed to do. I leaned forward slightly, wanting to make sure she could see my face clearly. I introduced myself the way I always do. I said, "Good morning," and I waited. The translator spoke softly to her, and she nodded, but her breathing didn't slow. I could hear it from where I sat, that shallow, fast breathing people get when fear takes over. I asked a simple question. I asked her if she understood why she was there. The translator relayed it, and the woman responded quietly. When the translator spoke back to me, her voice cracked just a little. She said the woman was very nervous because she had never been in a courtroom before. That hit me harder than she probably realized. I've seen hardened criminals stand in front of me without fear, but here was someone whose fear came from not understanding, not from guilt. I removed my glasses and set them down carefully. I wanted her to know I was listening. I told her to take her time. I said, "This is my courtroom, but it's also a place where people are heard." I watched her shoulders drop just a bit when the translator explained that to her. It was the first sign of relief I'd seen. As she began to speak through the translator, I learned that she was an immigrant. She had been in this country for only a few years. She worked long hours, cleaned offices at night, and took care of her children during the day. She didn't drive often, only when she had to. The charge against her was minor, but to her, it felt like the end of the world. I remember thinking about my own parents at that moment. I thought about how lost they must have felt when they first arrived here, not knowing the language, the rules, or the systems. I felt something tighten in my chest. I asked her a few more questions, slowly, carefully, making sure the translator had time to explain everything. Each time she answered, I could see her hands shaking less. She was starting to realize she wasn't in trouble just for being there. I told her something I've told many people over the years. I said, "This court is not here to scare you. It's here to help you understand and do better going forward." When the translator repeated my words, the woman's eyes filled with tears. She nodded over and over, like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. I could feel the entire room shift. The tension changed. People in the gallery leaned forward. I've learned that moments like these don't just affect the person in front of me. They affect everyone watching. I made my decision quickly but thoughtfully. I explained it clearly. I made sure the translator relayed every word. And when I told her the outcome, her knees nearly gave out. She covered her mouth with her hand and began to cry quietly, not loudly, just tears of relief. I said, "Case dismissed." I watched her look at the translator, then back at me, like she needed confirmation. When the translator nodded, the woman bowed her head slightly and whispered, "Thank you," over and over. I had to pause for a moment. I felt my eyes burn just a bit, and I took a deep breath. Let me tell you something I've learned after all these years. Sometimes the most powerful thing a judge can do is not punish, but understand. Now let me pause here for just a second. I need to ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where you were scared simply because you didn't understand what was happening? Leave me a comment and tell me about it, because I actually read them. And if this story is already speaking to you, hit that like button for me. I thought that would be the moment I remembered most from that morning. I thought that would be the case that stayed with me. But I had no idea what was about to happen next in my courtroom, and how quickly the tone of the entire day was about to change. After she left my courtroom, I sat there for a moment longer than usual. I watched her walk toward the exit with the translator, her steps lighter than when she entered. I remember thinking to myself that this was exactly why my father's words mattered. Respect first, judgment second. I adjusted my papers, took a sip of coffee that had gone lukewarm, and signaled to Christina that we could continue. The next few cases moved along like most mornings do. Traffic tickets, missed registrations, people explaining why they were late or why they forgot. I listened, I ruled, and I moved on. But I couldn't fully shake the image of that woman shaking hands. Something about her stayed with me, and I had a feeling the day wasn't finished teaching me its lesson. Around mid-morning, I noticed more people filling the gallery than usual. I always pay attention to that. When the benches start to fill, it tells me something is coming. People don't gather unless they sense drama or curiosity or trouble. I leaned back slightly and scanned the room. That's when I saw her. I saw a woman sitting near the middle row, legs crossed, scrolling on her phone like she was waiting for a table at a restaurant. She was dressed impeccably, designer bag at her feet, perfect hair, perfect nails. I watched her laugh quietly at something on her screen, completely disconnected from where she was. Something about her attitude didn't sit right with me. I've learned to trust that feeling. I watched as another case wrapped up, and then I heard Christina call the next name. The woman on her phone didn't look up at first. Christina called it again, a little louder this time. I saw the woman sigh, stand slowly, and walk toward the front like she was inconvenienced. I looked down at the file in front of me as she approached. I won't get into all the details just yet, but I'll tell you this. It wasn't serious on paper, nothing major, the kind of thing that could be resolved quickly with the right attitude. But attitude matters in my courtroom. I looked up at her and waited for her to stop texting. She didn't. I had to clear my throat. She finally glanced up, eyes half-lidded, and slipped her phone into her bag like she was doing me a favor. I introduced myself, as I always do, and asked her if she understood why she was there. She didn't answer right away. She adjusted her jacket, looked around the room, and then looked back at me with a smirk. I remember thinking, this is going to be one of those moments. She told me, very casually, that she was aware of the charge and that she didn't think it was a big deal. I asked her to explain what happened. She shrugged. I could hear a few murmurs in the gallery behind her. As she spoke, I noticed something else. I saw her glance over her shoulder toward the back of the courtroom. Her eyes landed briefly on the immigrant woman who had just been helped earlier and who was now waiting for a friend. I saw the look on her face, dismissive, judgmental, like she was looking down on someone beneath her. That told me more than any words could. I asked her another question calmly. I asked her if she understood the seriousness of being in court. She laughed, not loudly, but clearly. I heard it echo in my courtroom, and it sent a ripple through the room. I felt my jaw tighten. I leaned forward slightly and reminded her where she was. I said, "This is a court of law, not a place for jokes." She rolled her eyes. I could see Christina lower her head and shake it slowly. I felt my patience thinning, but I reminded myself of something I learned early in my career. When someone shows you who they are, don't rush. Let them keep talking. She began explaining herself again, and the more she spoke, the worse it got. She talked about her schedule, her meetings, her lifestyle. She mentioned money more than once, not directly, but enough that I could hear what she was really saying. I glanced at the file again, then back at her. I asked her one final question before ruling. I asked her if she believed the rules applied to her the same way they applied to everyone else in that room. She hesitated for just a second. Then she smiled, and that smile told me everything. She said something I'll never forget. She said, and I quote, "Your Honor, I don't mean any disrespect, but this is really nothing to me." I felt something rise in my chest, not anger, disappointment. I removed my glasses again and set them down, just like I had earlier that morning. I looked directly at her. I told her something my father taught me a long time ago. I said, respect isn't measured by what you can afford. It's measured by how you treat people when you think it doesn't matter. She didn't respond. She just crossed her arms and waited like she was bored. I paused. I let the silence sit. Silence is powerful if you let it work. Before I could speak again, I noticed movement in the back of the courtroom. A man stood up slowly. He was dressed plainly but confidently. I watched him step forward and raise his hand slightly, asking to be heard. I looked at Christina. She looked back at me with widened eyes. I could tell she hadn't expected this either. The man introduced himself, and as soon as he did, I felt the temperature in the room change. He identified himself as an assistant U.S. attorney. I straightened in my chair. He said he needed to bring something to my attention regarding the woman standing before me. I remember thinking to myself, this morning is not finished yet. I asked him to approach. He handed Christina an envelope, sealed, official. I watched her bring it to me with careful hands. When I opened it and began reading, my heart rate picked up. I looked back up at the woman. She was still standing there, arms crossed, confidence intact. She had no idea what was about to happen. I closed the folder slowly. I looked at the assistant attorney. I looked back at Christina, And then I looked at the woman in front of me. I had seen a lot in 40 years, but what I was holding in my hands was something else entirely. Before I tell you what was inside that envelope, let me stop for a moment. I want to ask you something. Have you ever watched someone act so confident, so untouchable, only to realize they had no idea what was coming? Leave me a comment and tell me what you think, and if you're still with me, hit that like button, because what happens next is something I'll never forget. I remember taking a slow breath before I said anything. I've learned over the years that moments like this deserve patience. I looked down at the papers again just to make sure I was reading them correctly. I wasn't mistaken, not even close. What I was holding explained so much about the confidence, the smirk, the careless laughter. I looked back up at her and studied her face. She was still standing there like nothing in the world could touch her. I remember thinking to myself that confidence without awareness is a dangerous thing. I asked the assistant U.S. attorney to explain in simple terms why he was interrupting my court. His voice was calm, professional. He said there was an ongoing federal investigation involving the defendant. He said my courtroom appearance that morning was connected to a much larger picture. I watched the color drain from her face just slightly. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me. I've seen that look before. It's the moment when control begins to slip. I asked her if she was aware of any federal matters involving her name. She laughed again, but this time it was different, forced, too quick. I could hear it crack at the end. She said no, of course not. She said there must be some mistake. I leaned forward so she could see my eyes clearly. I told her this wasn't the time for jokes. I told her this was the moment to listen carefully. As the assistant attorney continued, I began to understand the scope of what was unfolding. There were financial records, business dealings, names connected to shell companies, money moving where it shouldn't. I felt a tightness in my chest as the pieces came together. I thought back to the immigrant woman from earlier that morning, the way her hands shook, the way she was afraid simply because she didn't understand the process. And here stood someone who understood everything and thought she was untouchable. The contrast was impossible to ignore. I asked Christina for a moment. I could see she was processing everything too. I removed my glasses again, rubbed my eyes, and looked out at the courtroom. Everyone was silent now, no murmurs, no shifting. Time felt like it had slowed. I spoke carefully. I told the woman that the matter before me was no longer a simple case. I explained that there were serious allegations being reviewed at a federal level. I made sure my words were clear, calm, and measured. She interrupted me, she said, and I remember this exactly. Your Honor, this is ridiculous. I have lawyers. This is a misunderstanding. I felt my patience stretch thin, not snap, stretch. I held up my hand and asked her to stop. I told her this was not a conversation she was in control of anymore. I could see her breathing change, faster, shallower. Her arms uncrossed, and her hands moved to grip the edge of the podium. That confidence she walked in with was slipping through her fingers. I asked the assistant attorney one final question. I asked him if there was probable cause. He nodded, without hesitation. He said yes. I felt a weight settle in my chest, not satisfaction, responsibility. I've learned that justice doesn't feel good or bad. It feels necessary. I looked directly at her and spoke slowly. I said, 2 hours ago you laughed in my courtroom. You treated this place like an inconvenience, and now you're standing here realizing something important. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. I told her something I've said many times before. I said money can buy comfort, but it cannot buy immunity. I said the law doesn't bend for anyone, no matter how confident they feel walking in. I noticed tears forming in her eyes, real ones this time. Her hands were shaking now, just like the woman earlier that morning. That irony wasn't lost on me. I paused again. I had to. I felt the room holding its breath with me. That's when I noticed movement at the side door. 2 federal agents stepped in quietly. They stood still, waiting, professional, calm, ready. I watched her notice them. I saw her eyes widen. I saw her swallow hard. I heard her whisper my title, barely audible, asking for a moment. I told her something that might surprise you. I told her to breathe. I said panic won't help you now. I said this moment is the result of choices made long before today. I could feel the tension shift again. This time it wasn't dramatic. It was heavy, real. The agents stepped forward. I watched as they gently but firmly placed her hands behind her back. I'll never forget the sound of the cuffs closing. It echoed in my courtroom, sharp, final. Her designer handbag slipped from her shoulder and hit the floor. Nobody moved to pick it up, not a single person. I thought again about the immigrant woman. I wondered where she was at that moment. I hoped she was already home, holding her children, telling them everything was okay. I looked out at the gallery and spoke to everyone, not just the woman being escorted out. I said this courtroom exists to serve justice, not privilege. I said every person who stands here does so on equal ground. I felt my voice steady, clear, certain. As the agents led her away, she turned back once, just once. Our eyes met. There was no anger there anymore, just fear and regret. I nodded slightly, not in judgment, in acknowledgement. When the door closed behind her, the room exhaled. I could hear it. I took a deep breath myself and adjusted my papers. I looked at Christina and said softly that we would take a short recess. She nodded. I could tell she needed a moment, too. Before I stepped away, I looked out at the courtroom one last time. I wanted everyone there to understand what they had witnessed, not a downfall, a reminder. Now let me stop here for just a moment. I want to ask you something honestly. Have you ever seen someone humbled in an instant? When reality finally catches up, leave me a comment and tell me what you think. And if you're still listening, still feeling this story, hit that like button for me. When I stepped into my chambers during that short recess, I closed the door behind me and stood there for a moment in silence. I didn't sit down right away. I just stood, listening to my own breathing slow. After 4 decades on this bench, moments like that still find a way to settle deep in my bones. I poured myself a small cup of water and thought about how quickly the courtroom can transform from routine to unforgettable. I thought about my wife for a second. I imagined what she would say if I told her about this morning. She's always been my grounding force. She knows when I've had a heavy day just by the way I loosen my tie when I get home. I smiled faintly, then straightened myself and headed back out. When I returned to the bench, the room was quieter than before. Not just silent, but attentive. I could feel it. People were sitting straighter. Phones were gone. Eyes were forward. I've learned that when people witness accountability, something shifts inside them. I called the next case, and life in my courtroom resumed. But nothing felt ordinary anymore. I noticed the way people spoke to me, softer, more careful. I noticed the way they listened when I explained things. That's the power of example. You don't need to raise your voice to teach a lesson. As the morning moved on, I kept thinking about the woman from earlier, the immigrant who came in shaking, afraid of a system she didn't understand. I wondered if she had heard what happened afterward. I wondered what she would think if she knew how differently the law had met 2 people in the same room, not because of who they were, but because of how they acted. I called another case involving a young man who had missed a court date. He was nervous but respectful. I explained the situation, gave him guidance, and watched relief wash over his face. I remember thinking to myself that fear disappears when people feel seen. Around noon, Christina leaned toward me and quietly told me that the assistant U.S. attorney wanted to speak with me later that afternoon. I nodded. I already knew that conversation was coming. You don't witness something like that without follow-up. As we broke for lunch, I walked through the hallway and greeted a few people waiting outside. Some nodded, some thanked me. One older woman stopped me and said she'd never seen anything like what happened that morning. I told her neither had I, not quite like that, and I meant it. I ate lunch at my desk that day, a simple sandwich, nothing fancy. I don't need much when my mind is full. I sat there thinking about the delicate balance we walk in this job. Compassion without weakness, authority without arrogance, justice without cruelty. I remembered something my mentor told me early in my career. He said, "Frank, the robe doesn't make you powerful, it makes you responsible." That thought stayed with me as I finished my lunch and prepared for the afternoon session. When court resumed, everything moved quickly. Case after case, decision after decision. But in the back of my mind, I knew the day wasn't over for me yet. Not really. Late in the afternoon, after the last case was called, I returned to my chambers. Christina knocked softly and let me know the assistant U.S. attorney had arrived. I told her to send him in. He walked in with the same calm presence he'd had earlier. He thanked me for allowing him to speak during court. I told him it was my duty to listen when something serious comes to light. He explained more details than he could share earlier. He spoke about the investigation, how long it had been building, how carefully it had been handled. The numbers he mentioned were staggering. Millions of dollars, years of deception. I felt a chill run through me. I leaned back in my chair and shook my head slowly. I told him how close that woman came to walking out of my courtroom with nothing more than a fine. He nodded and said, "Timing can change everything." That stayed with me. Timing. How many lives hinge on the smallest moments? After he left, I sat alone for a while. I looked at the photo on my desk of my family, my children, my grandchildren. I thought about the kind of world they're inheriting. I thought about what kind of examples we set every day, whether we realize it or not. I packed up slowly and left the courthouse as the sun began to set. The building looked the same as it always does, but I felt different walking out. Days like that remind you that this job isn't about rules on paper, it's about people. That night at home, my wife noticed it immediately. She asked me how my day was, and I told her it was one of those days, the kind you don't forget. I shared the broad strokes, and she listened quietly, just like she always does. When I finished, she reached for my hand and squeezed it gently. That was all I needed. I went to bed that night thinking about fairness, about fear, about how power reveals character. Sleep didn't come quickly, but when it did, it was deep. Now let me pause here and ask you something personal. Have you ever had a day that completely changed how you saw the world? One moment that stayed with you long after it passed? Leave me a comment and tell me about it. I truly want to know. And if this story is resonating with you, if you believe these moments matter, hit that like button for me. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. I didn't need an alarm. My mind was already moving before my feet touched the floor. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, strong and black like always, and stared out the window longer than I normally do. The events of the day before kept replaying in my head, not like noise, but like quiet reminders. I thought again about the immigrant woman. I kept seeing her hands shaking as she stood before me, unsure of everything except her fear. I wondered how many people like her walk into courtrooms across this country every day, believing the system is there to punish them instead of guide them. That thought stayed with me as I got dressed and headed out. When I arrived at the courthouse at 8:15, just like every other morning, Christina greeted me with a smile and my coffee. She could tell I was tired, but she didn't say anything. She never does. She knows when silence is better than questions. Court began on time and the morning cases rolled in. But something else rolled in with them too. Word. People talk. They always do. I could sense that many in the room already knew what had happened the day before. There was a different energy, a quiet respect in the air. Midway through the morning, Christina leaned toward me and whispered that someone was asking to see me. She said it was a woman who claimed I might remember her from the previous day. I felt my chest tighten slightly. I had a feeling I knew who it was. I told her to bring the woman to my chambers during the break. When the time came, I watched her step into my office slowly. It was the same immigrant woman. She looked different now, still humble, still reserved, but not shaking anymore. She was holding a small envelope in her hands, gripping it with care. She smiled nervously when she saw me. The translator was with her again, but this time the woman spoke first, quietly, in her own language. When the translator relayed her words, I felt my throat tighten. She said she just wanted to say thank you. I gestured for her to sit down. I told her she didn't owe me anything. She shook her head gently. She said she needed me to understand what that moment in court had meant to her. She said she had been afraid of authority her entire life, and that for the first time she felt protected instead of judged. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I rarely do when someone is brave enough to speak from the heart. She told me about her children, about the long nights cleaning offices, about learning English one word at a time. She said that standing in my courtroom, hearing kindness instead of anger, made her feel like she belonged here. I felt tears well up in my eyes. I'm not ashamed to admit that. I removed my glasses and rubbed my eyes, pretending to adjust them. Moments like that remind me why this job still matters to me after all these years. Before she left, she handed me the envelope. I told her she didn't have to. She insisted. Inside was a handwritten note, simple, messy handwriting, just a few lines, but every word carried weight. I thanked her and wished her well. As she left, I sat there holding that envelope for a long time. That afternoon, I learned more about the case from the previous day. The federal investigation had moved quickly. Charges were being formalized, assets frozen. The process was already in motion long before she walked into my courtroom. But it was her behavior that revealed everything at exactly the wrong time. I sat back and thought about irony, about how arrogance blinds people, about how fear can humble someone but respect can lift them. That night at home, I showed my wife the note. She read it quietly and smiled through tears. She told me I did the right thing. I told her I just did my job. She shook her head and said, "No, you did more than that." As the days passed, the story continued to unfold in the news. People asked me about it, but I never shared details. I never needed to. The lesson wasn't about scandal. It was about character. A week later, I received an update. The woman who had laughed in my courtroom was now facing consequences far greater than anything she imagined that morning. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt resolution. Justice isn't about celebrating downfall. It's about restoring balance. I thought again about timing, about how close she came to walking away without accountability, and how close she was to learning nothing at all. Now let me stop here and ask you something honestly. Do you believe kindness is a weakness, or do you believe it takes strength? I've seen both sides of that argument in this courtroom. Leave me a comment and tell me what you think. And if you're still with me, still feeling this story, hit that like button for me. A few weeks passed after that morning, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the story still wasn't finished. I've learned over the years that some cases don't end when the courtroom doors close. They linger, they follow you home, they sit quietly in your thoughts when the house is still. One afternoon, after court had ended and most of the building had emptied, Christina brought me a piece of mail. She set it gently on my desk and told me it had arrived earlier that day. I didn't recognize the handwriting at first. It was careful, deliberate, like someone was choosing each letter slowly. I opened it without expectation, but the moment I read the first line, I knew exactly who it was from. It was the woman who had been arrested in my courtroom. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the wall for a moment before continuing. I wasn't sure how I felt about reading it. Judges are trained to maintain distance, to stay impartial, but we're also human, whether people realize it or not. I kept reading. She wrote about that morning, about how confident she felt walking into court, about how she truly believed none of it mattered. She admitted that she had spent years thinking rules were flexible if you had enough resources. Seeing those words in her own handwriting carried a weight I didn't expect. She wrote about the moment she laughed, about how she saw herself from the outside for the first time when the cuffs closed around her wrists. She said she had never been afraid like that before, not of losing money, but of losing control. I paused again and removed my glasses. I could feel the room growing quiet around me, even though I was alone. I've read thousands of letters in my career, but very few carry genuine self-awareness. She didn't ask for mercy. She didn't ask for favors. She didn't even ask for forgiveness. She wrote to acknowledge something she had never faced before: responsibility. She said something that stayed with me. She said she kept thinking about the other woman in the courtroom, the one who needed a translator. She admitted she had judged her without knowing anything about her. She said she finally understood what real fear looked like. I folded the letter carefully and set it aside. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel sympathy either. I felt reflection. That's something far more rare. That same week, I received another update from the U.S. Attorney's Office. The investigation had uncovered more than they initially expected. The funds recovered were substantial, enough to make a difference beyond punishment. I remember sitting there thinking about how money can cause harm, but it can also be redirected to do good when justice steps in. That thought stayed with me longer than I expected. A few days later, Christina came into my chambers with a smile that told me she had good news. She said she thought I'd want to hear this. She told me that a portion of the recovered funds was being allocated to community programs, education, legal aid, scholarships. I felt something warm settle in my chest. That's the part of justice people don't talk about enough. Restoration. I thought again about the immigrant woman and her children. I wondered how many doors might open because of this unexpected chain of events. One moment of arrogance leading to accountability. One moment of fear leading to kindness. That weekend, my grandson came to visit. He's 12 now, curious about everything. He asked me what I do all day in court. I laughed and told him I listen. A lot. He asked why that was important. I told him that listening is how you understand people, and understanding is how you make fair decisions. He nodded like he was filing that away for later. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat quietly with the letter again. I read it one more time. I thought about change, about whether people truly can learn when consequences finally catch up. I don't believe everyone changes, but I do believe some moments crack open something real. Before I go on, let me stop here and ask you something important. Do you believe people can truly change when they're forced to face the truth about themselves? Or do you think change only comes when someone wants it? Leave me a comment and tell me what you think. I genuinely want to know. And if you believe accountability matters, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed, because this story isn't finished yet. Not long after that, something happened that brought the entire story full circle for me. It was a quiet afternoon in my chambers when Christina knocked on the door and told me someone was asking to see me. She said the woman didn't have an appointment, but she felt it was important. When I stepped out and saw who it was, my heart softened instantly. It was the immigrant woman again. She stood there with the same humility as before, but this time there was confidence in her posture. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't afraid. She held her head a little higher, like someone who finally felt seen. The translator stood beside her, but I could already tell something had changed. I invited her into my chambers and asked her how she was doing. She smiled before the translator could even speak. When her words came through, they were filled with gratitude, but also pride. She told me her life had been lighter since that day in court. She said she slept better. She said she no longer felt invisible. Then she told me something that stopped me cold. She said her daughter had been awarded a scholarship. I leaned forward in my chair, making sure I heard that correctly. She explained that the scholarship came from a new community fund, a fund created from money recovered through a federal case. She didn't need to say which one. I already knew. I felt my throat tighten. I thought about timing again, about how fear and arrogance collided in one courtroom on one ordinary morning and somehow led to opportunity for a child who had done nothing but hope. She said her daughter wanted to become a nurse. She said she wanted to help people the way she felt helped that day in court. Tears filled my eyes, and this time I didn't hide them. I let them come. I stood up and shook her hand. I told her something I believe with all my heart. I told her that this country works best when people lift each other up, not when they look down on one another. She nodded, smiling through tears of her own. After she left, I sat alone for a long time. I thought about the weight of choices, about how one act of kindness can echo far beyond the moment it's given, and how one act of disrespect can unravel a life built on false confidence. I think about that day often, not because of the arrest or the headlines or the drama, but because of the contrast. Two women standing in the same courtroom, facing the same system. One came in shaking, afraid, and left empowered. The other came in laughing, confident, and left humbled. My father used to tell me something else when I was young. He said, "Frank, this country will give you opportunity, but it demands character in return." I didn't fully understand that when I was a boy. I understand it now. After 40 years on this bench, I still believe the law is the great equalizer. Not because it's perfect, but because it strives to be fair when guided by humanity. Money can't buy integrity, it can't buy respect, and it certainly can't buy your way above the law. So let me ask you this, do you think I was too harsh on her? Or not harsh enough? I'm genuinely curious what you think. And here's another question for you. If you were in my position, what would you have done? Would you have shown mercy or delivered justice? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I actually read them, every single one. If this story meant something to you, if you believe in equal justice like I do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Turn on that bell icon so you never miss another story from my courtroom. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message, someone who believes that character matters more than cash. And check out the next video on your screen. I've got another incredible story from my courtroom that you won't believe. I'll see you tomorrow with another lesson about justice, respect, and what really matters in this life. I'm Frank Caprio. I've been on this bench for 40 years because I believe something simple. We're all equal before the law, every single one of us, rich or poor, powerful or powerless. That's what makes this country work. Thank you for listening to my story. God bless you, and remember, respect costs nothing, but it's worth everything.